Hey everyone, and welcome back to another lecture here in Anthropology 107. As you know, the anthropology of magic, witchcraft, and religion. So we are working on week 5 now. So depending on how you look at things, week 5 or 6 is about midterm. So we are moving right along in the class. Hopefully at this point in the class, you have a good sense of the format, understanding how the readings work with the modules, you're prepared with your discussions, and you generally feel maybe confident with the class such that you have a foundation that allows you to consider some of these issues that we're dealing with now. And as I said, early in the quarter, you get that foundational stuff in weeks 1 and 2, and then 3 through really week 9 or so, week 8, you get a lot of special topics. And then we close the class out with 2 weeks on pop culture as well as diversity, and then 1 week, week 11, to wrap things up that focuses on syncretism, or how things come together kind of in the global scene of religion. I also hope that at this point in the class, you're okay with the discussions. Again, I'm really emphasizing not to use AI in this class, and that you focus on your own opinions and attitudes. Indeed, have some debates in the class as we talk about some of these issues this week and into the rest of the quarter. So let's jump in here and get started. So for week 5, we're going to have a series of 4 different topics. Quite a number of these relate together. So we'll talk about the altered state of consciousness, which I think is a very fun topic for people. In fact, coming out of last week's focus on Burning Man, I might say that some people who go to Burning Man want to desire to achieve an altered state of consciousness through psychedelics, through art, through transformation of the self, and so forth. A lot of people get super emotional there in terms of their activities on the playa, all the art scene with art cars and everything. So, I mean, there's kind of a transition from ritual to altered states. You're going to note that in some cases, people take on an altered state of consciousness in order to participate and to be effective, maybe experiencing a ritual in their lives. So the altered state, I think, is in a sense a connection to what we talked about in week 4. We're also going to talk about religion and the self and religion and the negative. And specific to religion and the self, we're going to talk about prohibition. And I mention here in this module that you're going to note some overlap in the content in weeks 5 and 6. So don't be upset about that. And it's just a matter that, you can't neatly separate some of these topics, but I did want to separate them and not have everything pile up in one giant module. So you're going to see some of that, but when we're talking about religion and prohibition, we're typically saying that a religion has defined a code for you and has told you you can't do this to your body, or you can't consume this kind of meat or animal product, or you can't have this kind of sexual relationship, or you can't have a tattoo. Or it could be the opposite of that. It could be offering people that they can do any and all of those things. So it kind of just depends, of course, on the religion. Not every religion is about prohibition, but I think we see a lot of religions that prohibit things. The sort of tradition in the Bible, in the Ten Commandments, is about prohibition. Thou shalt not fill in the blank kind of thing. So I think we're very familiar with prohibition being a part of religion. And then connected to that, we'll talk about what I'm calling religion and the negative. So the negative means sometimes religions get out of hand, and as a result of this, just like political movements, we have people justifying violence. We have people justifying sacrifice, persecution of other people. You even have religious warfare. So it's a topic I think we need to cover, and then at the end of that, we'll have a short conversation about cultural appropriation in the context of Western yoga, which is one example I think is quite interesting and curious because it's taking traditions of Indian society, adapting them, adopting them in various ways, but maybe changing it in such a sense that people would say it's an example of cultural appropriation. And then we'll end with the work of Hans Kung. I mentioned him last week, the great late theologian who came up with this idea of a global ethic. And in all honesty, traditionally, I put this section or this reading, this kind of little subset of a module at the very end in week 11. But I looked at week 11 and there's a ton of stuff there already. So I was running out of room. So I really needed to kind of tack it on here as part 4 of the week 5 module, which I think is fine because I was talking about it last week. And it's a nice bookend, or if you will, counterpart to the negativity of religion. If we're talking this week about how religions often use justification for warfare, for persecution of people, and so forth, can we imagine the opposite? Can we imagine a global consciousness of some form where various religions could come together and perhaps peacefully coexist? And I think that's really the key idea of the late Hans Kung, and he's someone I've been teaching about for, well, close to probably 30 years or so here. So let's go back to the beginning here, and we'll consider each of these four parts. So the first part we're going to be talking about is the altered state of consciousness. And as you're familiar with, this is where the lecture will live. You can also find it on my announcement, and I typically try to send that out to you once a week. So first off, we're going to talk here a little bit about the origins of religion. So we're going back in a sense, but the reason for this is really to stress what you see here as the first topic, which is the bioevolution of religion. So this is the idea that there could be genetic predispositions for religion. There could be a structure in the brain. And recall, we've talked about some of that already in this class. I wanted to use this though, because I think when you get into the altered state of consciousness, we know that there's a likelihood that Neanderthals, Cro-Magnons, early humans 50 more or more thousand years ago were probably doing things like, we know they were doing cave painting. We know that they were burying their loved ones with grave goods, what we call, that we discover in their graves. And perhaps they were also using altered states as a way of achieving a trance or a state of consciousness to communicate with higher powers. So it's kind of important before we get into the altered state that because it's such a biological condition, if you think about, if you take most drugs, they will have a biological, physiological effect on you. So this is not one where we can only talk about the cultural side of things or even the psychological side of things. We definitely have to talk about the biocultural hand in hand as we consider, in this case, what psychedelics or altered states of consciousness might do to individuals. Now, I just mentioned the idea of Neanderthal burials. So one theory out there is that if you find grave goods, so you find things buried in graves that have no utilitarian purpose, and by utilitarian we mean practical purpose. So you find something that maybe is not just preventing the body from decaying, but it's something that's symbolic, going back to our conversations we've had the last few weeks about symbolism. So you find something like it could be a bird's wing, and it's decayed, and you find the bones, and you find those bones buried with that of an early human. And you say, well, using inference and using scientific knowledge, there's a pretty good chance that people maybe had a sense of self. They had a conception of self and other, so they could relate to the other person. And maybe they also had a sense of the divine. And actually, if you think about that, just to do a quick diagram here, this is pretty important as we start to understand the interconnections of altered states to religions themselves. Again, we're talking this week about a biocultural perspective, which means we take in the cultural and the biological. So with ASC, or altered states of consciousness, there's a biological impact, and it's also cultural at the same time, because if we find grave goods, we realize that symbols suggest to us a cultural construct of the altered state, the religion, the burial, etc. So when we talk about self and other, we get into the idea that when people start to recognize that there's someone outside themselves who is important and maybe worthy of protection, worthy of being friends with and a partner with, we start to understand that something is happening in terms of human consciousness. And then we typically would say there's another relationship here, and that's a relationship to the divine. Whatever the divine is defined as, it's a little hard to say. So when we start to see things like grave goods and these symbolic things left behind for us to discover, we start to make some inference. We say, if you bury someone with a symbol, there's probably something going on there symbolic. So we start to think there could be religiosity in some form. We can never locate at an exact point in time when religious experience or spiritual experience starts. But it's super important to use some of the evidence here, whether that's biological evidence, what we know about human anatomy, brain function, language development, and of course, the archaeological record. If you take my Anthro 101 class, Intro to Archaeology, we'll talk more about this in depth. And indeed, it's one of my favorite sections where we talk about what we call the creative revolution, a point 50 or so thousand years ago where we see things like these grave goods in graves. We see cave art. We see Venus figurines. So something is going on at perhaps an aesthetic level, a level of consciousness, and then also at a level of what we call early religion, this religiosity. So we see the symbols. We think something is going on symbolic. Hence, we have a cultural assumption here that is being made. And then we start to say, well, wait a second. Why would you go through the trouble if you're living in such harsh times as Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons, early Homo sapiens, archaic Homo sapiens were living very tough lives? Why would you take that extra time to bury someone with grave goods, with symbols, with something that perhaps has a spiritual meaning behind it, if it didn't have a purpose? So that is also telling us that probably some connection to the divine is going on. There is a recognition of the self and the other. You care about someone so much that you're willing to risk your life. You're willing to spend a little more time burying them with something that is symbolic and non-utilitarian. So perhaps you begin to see how we piece together this puzzle here and why we want to focus so carefully on our early human ancestors, because really, based on what we've seen in the archaeological record, we have a pretty clear indication that something is going on. And again, you see here some information about a possible cave bear cult. And if you've seen the Clan of the Cave Bear, very kind of by Jean Ellul, that whole set of books, fascinating stuff, very entertaining stuff, but it doesn't necessarily mean that early humans, shared collective unconsciousness. If you read folks like Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, of course, there was a belief in this. So some people have projected this, but that would be kind of speculative. But at the same time, we're saying, we're inferring things here. When we see something like a grave good, something symbolic in a grave, we assume it has a religious meaning. We assume it's symbolic. We assume that there's a connection to the divine. We assume that there's altruism, meaning that people care about others, such that we see all this evidence in these graves. And this is a representation of a cave bear from AI. So I think you might have fun with this. It's a slightly longer reading, but it has a lot of good information. And then as you get into the origin of religion, particularly pay attention to this, because this will give you some different theories on how maybe altered states of consciousness themselves could have led way into religion. So if you're experiencing something because you take some hallucinogenics, some psychedelics, and you have an altered state during those moments, maybe it's pleasurable, it's something that gives you meaning in that moment, and thus you continue to take those drugs, those substances to achieve the altered state, and it suggests maybe a connection to the divine as you interpret everything, because of course mushrooms or other properties out there, hallucinogenics, can give one very vivid hallucinations, can send you into a trance state, and so forth. So I think there's a lot to unpack in this first module page. This may take you a little bit longer just because it's so long. And then this is our connection to module 4. So we're saying ritual could be the origin of religion. So if ritual is the origin of religion, and we know that altered states are a part of it, I think it's pretty important to start piecing together these various pieces. So check out that rather long reading there. This is a shorter one, Early Humans and Religion. So these are some of the things I mentioned earlier. So we have evidence like cave art and Venus figurines, and of course the burial rituals, megalithic monuments, various shamanic practices. Again, you start to discover certain paintings, maybe representations of what we call therianthropes, and therianthropes are half human, half animal. We find those on a cave wall. If this was a cave wall, this would be cave art here. It wouldn't be these representations. But those representations then give us some inkling that perhaps something is going on here with early shamanism. If someone was, we can interpret some of the cave art at famous places like Lascaux in France. If someone was maybe venerating a god or paying attention to nature, and perhaps the hope was that you would be successful in the hunt if you perform some sort of ritual, we can start to piece some of that together, just like art historians are doing the process of unpacking a painting or a sculpture and trying to figure out what the heck does this mean, Anthropologists, archaeologists can do similar things. So shamanic practice is very interesting here. We often say that shamans, as we'll talk about in our section on religious specialists, have a connection to the divine. They're intermediaries, and sometimes they use trance or altered states to achieve that connection to the divine. So now we start to take that piecing together of evidence and say, did early humans play around with altered states of consciousness? And again, I think we're talking about here things that require some level of inference. So we see possible shamanic practices, rituals, evidence of vision quests, community bonding, cave and rock art. Again, you might say, well, maybe people were doing cave art, maybe people were burying their dead with grave goods, and it was purely random. It was just happenstance. But the way that we understand culture, how we understand human nature and its connection to culture, I think we begin to say there are meanings behind the representations aesthetically that we have. And some of those meanings could be aesthetic. Some of those meanings could be political, could be religious, of course. So a lot of, unanswered questions, but I think opportunities for us to take really a little more liberty this week and be speculative and give your own opinions. If you've read some work out there that's talked about altered states in early humans, please include that this week. The more the merrier, I would say. We can also talk about how anthropologists might study an altered state of consciousness. There was the old Carlos Castaneda, very famous anthropologist who studied the Yaqui in South America, and he claimed to have met a guy named Don Juan, sort of a spirit guide, when he was taking a particular substance to achieve an ASC, an altered state of consciousness. That's not traditional. Again, you could go to Burning Man and you could be an individual and you might partake in hallucinogenics or whatever is possibly offered there, but not everybody is comfortable doing that. But some who have certainly would say it allows them to achieve an even more emic understanding of something like an altered state of consciousness. And these are some examples of maybe how you could study them or what these case studies might tell us about. And if you're curious about any of these five, just go ahead and Google and look up more information. But I think you'll find a lot of curious information with these case studies. And again, it doesn't just have to be drugs. When you talk about ritualistic fasting or mortification of the flesh, that happened traditionally with some Native American groups like the Mandan in Native America, you don't necessarily have to just use a drug in order to achieve an altered state. It could happen through fasting, through sleep deprivation. If you've ever been sleep deprived, you start to hallucinate. And you could think about just how one of those hallucination sessions, if you're driving late at night, you see something, how that could be a very clear connection to something biocultural that we're talking about this week. When we think about you see something out of the corner of your eye, perhaps that has significance. Or with all the UAP, the unidentified aerial phenomenon that we've been talking about, that we've been seeing in the news here in 2023, similar things going on. Some people say that there are clear explanations as to why sometimes late at night you see something. So a lot of opportunities, I think, to think about some curious situations going on, maybe some that more fall into the realm of things like the paranormal, and we start talking about ghosts and so forth, which we'll cover later in the quarter. Now, I do have a lecture here. I'm trying to remember if I covered this. I don't always remember. I've written the quizzes some time ago if I've covered all this, but my recommendation to you, it's something you can go back to and check out. This is a lecture I did years ago in the face-to-face version of this class. So check that out just because I think it gives you some good context on how we study altered states in anthropology. And in a sense, it's a supplement to this lecture I'm doing here. So at least check out the first part of it to get a sense of the vibe I'm going for with that lecture. So Psychedelic Society. So someone I've been very curious with for many years is the late Terence McKenna. He was an ethnobotanist, a psychedelic advocate, not unlike Timothy Leary. And he talked about this idea of the Psychedelic Society. And the Psychedelic Society, he said, would be a society based on people using psychedelics. And whenever I've shown this video in class, I always say, hey, this is fairly controversial because he's going to be saying something that maybe not all of us are going to be on board with. And I don't know personally if I'm on board with this. I don't know if I want my bus driver, taking psychedelics, right? But maybe I want my librarian taking psychedelics. Do I want my politician taking psychedelics? Might be better than some of the choices out there. But the psychedelic society in the mind of McKenna is not just about people popping pills and getting high or whatever. It really is philosophical and conceptual. So on this next page here, I encourage you to check out like the first little bit of the Psychedelic Society. It's a fairly long video, but he is really delving deep into philosophy, into all sorts of historical information about early religions. And he's not just sort of saying, hey, I want everyone to get high. He's saying we need to use psychedelics in a way to break down some of these barriers of self and other. So if we were mapping McKenna here, we would say that drugs or some sort of psychedelics, because it could be virtual reality as well, that could radically alter your consciousness, that some use of an altered state will allow you to break down self and other, will allow you to break down a hierarchy in society, will help us deal with racism and classism and the divide between, the rich and the poor and so forth. And a lot of people in the 60s, you might know, like McKenna, the Beat Poets, I think they had a very idealistic notion of society, but I 100% give them credit because they are literally and figuratively thinking outside the box, because they are saying, hey, let's try something new. This is an opportunity to expand our consciousness. So I encourage you to look at this. You can watch the whole thing if you want. If you absolutely hate it, that's fine. You could talk about that on your discussion board. And anytime I show this video in my face-to-face class, we always have a debate at the end. And to some degree, I unpack some of what he's saying. He speaks a lot in metaphor and examples, and there's a lot of historical reference to classics and so forth, philosophy, ancient societies, that maybe you don't have a grasp of all that stuff, but very, very, very curious argument. So I want to use this kind of as a springboard, or I guess catalyst, to have a conversation about what McKenna is saying. So that's our first section, focusing on the altered state of consciousness. Again, you have some good stuff there to look at with the foundations of religion as being biocultural. We have the case study here of Terence McKenna. We talk about all that early human information. So this is a nice, foundation, I think, to have. We could have easily had this in week 1, but again, putting a class like this together requires some sense of, Tetrising everything so that it will fit nicely. So next we have section 2, which is religion and prohibition. So this is where we're going to say religions will tell you various things. They will say we have a moral code, and then that moral code will guide your actions. So because it says in the Bible A, we require you to do this. And there is always sort of action that's connected to the foundation, could be the set of values in the sacred text. This also reminds us of our work talking last couple weeks about symbolism. We talked that symbols are very curious, going back to Victor Turner's work, because they condense a lot of things in one form. They sometimes are a shorthand, a simplification, but are hyper complex in terms of their implications. We talked about the notion of symbols instigating social action via the work of Dred Scott Tyler and that old piece in the 80s, early 90s, what's the proper way to display the American flag. So you're actually familiar with what we're talking about here, because we had this same focus when we talked about symbols just a few weeks ago. So what we're talking about here could be any moral admonishment to people in a religion that could relate to things like their body. It could relate to notions of sacredness and purity. To go back to the work of Mary Douglas, we looked at her work, Natural Symbols. She has a very important work that I read it as an undergrad, Purity and Danger. And a lot of anthropologists have looked at prohibitions that are stated in religious texts or religious codes as a clear foundation of understanding almost the essence of the religion at hand. And it makes a lot of sense, right? If my religion says, if I take the Raelians and say it's okay for people to have sex outside of marriage, and maybe they shouldn't be married and they could have group sex in meditation retreats and so forth, which are all real things, by the way, versus someone who says you are a very strict Christian and you must be married before you have sexual intercourse. And there are all these restrictions, and maybe you can't take contraceptions depending on, some Catholic belief and so forth. Those are two radically different sets of statements, normative statements, meaning values. Norms relate to values. If we're being normative, we're saying you better do this or you better not do this. But if I take the Catholic version and the Raelian version, those are as opposite as almost is imaginable. Or we could bring in another group like Scientology and what they have to say. So the point we're making here is that religions are going to prescribe certain things. You may or may not agree with those prescriptions, and thus we get into the real ideological struggles that happen within religions in our society. And one thing I've discovered teaching a lot in the sociology of deviance is that very often these prohibitions that come up by religions relate to your body. And we have some theories here. The Marxist theory would say the reason for that is we're trying to control you. We're trying to literally do what Michel Foucault, the philosopher, says is institute biopower on our populations. We're trying to control our population. So we might say, we're going to restrict sexual intercourse, or we're going to require that people have, take contraceptions. It could be the opposite if, there's a desire to grow your population. But the body is really the foundation upon which things are written symbolically and sometimes literally. So here are some examples of that. Dietary restrictions. When we get into the focus on the way down, which some people have said is a religious cult, literally talking about fasting as a way of achieving sort of a connection to Christ, as a connection to God. Fasting and abstinence. Again, a lot of religions say during this time of the year you can't eat, or you can only eat certain things during Lent, etc. So it's pretty interesting that food itself is such a powerful symbolic force. And if you look at Deuteronomy and Leviticus, you see so many prohibitions relative to eating of certain types of animals and not eating of certain types of animals and so forth. Modesty and dress codes. Maybe if you've seen certain religious schools, they require that people dress a certain way. When I talked about, or will talk about, my experiences at the Holy Land Experience in the Creation Museum in Kentucky, it was very interesting because people who attended those places, who came, literally flocked to those places, had similar sort of dress codes. I'm not sure if they were Mennonite, I'm not sure of their religious background, but they all had very sort of strict dress codes. All the women were wearing very similar outfits. And, sometimes there was a shielding of the face, some kind of covering, not a hijab, but, a different type of covering. So it's interesting that so often the body is a site of almost like symbolic warfare upon which, certain religions craft practices or admonishments and say, you must do this or you can't do this. Certain forms of behavior and rules of living. Again, we could talk about how certain requirements are made in a religion, not bearing false witness and so forth. And there are just so many out there that are, tens of thousands, if not millions, of admonishments or prohibitions that are required in terms of people's behavior. This is one where we might be able to have a interesting conversation or discussions. And the reason for this is I feel like a lot of people are critical of organized religion when we see a contradiction between the word and the deed. So it says in the Bible this, or you're required in your small community to go to church, temple, synagogue once a week to, quote, be a good person. But yet, in your deeds, you're doing something that you're not supposed to be doing. So you're out at the bar on the weekend, you're at church on Sunday, but you're out at the bar that same night and you're drinking, and maybe you're expressing extreme behavior. Now, again, I'm not saying this is good or bad. This is where we get into the realm of cultural relativity, because why should alcohol be seen as holy, as sacred, or profane? Why should anything be seen as sacred or profane? We go all the way back to week 1, talking about the empty vessel of Zizek. We go back to the conversations we've had about how we can easily construct something, a rule, and yet contradict that rule in the same or the next sentence. So this is the real realm of the subjective when we start talking about behavior. Now, here are 10 examples of religious prohibitions. Take a look at these. Have you heard of any of these? Have you practiced them? I think it might be interesting this week to talk about prohibitions. And if this comes up in the discussions, I would say as much as you're willing to talk about this stuff, talk about it. Again, use your own sense of judgment. If you feel like it's too sensitive or intimate for you, write about something else or take a more God's eye view, I guess I could say, of this, as opposed to getting down to what your actual practices are, so you can decide. Bodies. So we were just talking about why bodies are an important site that we are controlling. Again, from a Marxist perspective, the Marxist is saying, there's a reason I'm telling you what to do with your body. And so we have to kind of unravel what exactly is going on. That's happening at that very edict level, the outsiders level, because at the emic level, typically we're saying, hey, I'm told I can't eat meat on this day, so I'm not going to eat meat. I'm not going to question that. It gets into really, when we talk about religion and prohibition, we're getting into the foundations, the core of religion, and that's kind of why we talked about the altered states and the origins of religion. Music as well here too. So, you have all sorts of views on music and how music can be used for religious experience. We'll actually come back to this later in the quarter in a couple weeks. We can also talk about blood. And I think a really good section just to see how the body is implicated in this. Here's another one here as well, very short section, but just talking about how the body itself could be related to what Mary Douglas, again, our anthropologist from, I believe it was last week, talked about as the natural symbol. And then you can see that in certain ceremonial contexts, dress is super important. I think about many societies where Orthodox Judaism, where you see dress being such a key part of identity. And that really takes us back, I think, to this discussion of the altered state and cave art, because you think maybe in early society, a lot of this is not still present in the archaeological record, but in maybe early society, it was the case that we would distinguish ourselves from other for the sense of security. You might say this is an anti-altruistic position. And in fact, I've read some interesting research on this, trying to say, was there a point, perhaps, and this is going to get a little mystical, so hold on for a second, and don't judge me for saying it, but some people would suggest, maybe like a Jungian, that maybe there was a point in early human society where self and other was barely a distinction, and there was almost pure altruism. Again, this is very speculative, and some would say too idealistic. Maybe at that point we had some shared consciousness, maybe not in a Carl Jungian sense, we actually could telepathically connect with one another, but there was something in our mind very similar, and we cared for one another. We had altruism. Something then comes in our development as a society that causes us to not trust others and to become very tribalistic and what we call today in religion sectarian. Sectarianism refers to the idea that we see self and other. We talked about othering before in this class. We see someone as the other. We don't respect them. And that's why we also have this section this week and next week about religious warfare and violence and persecution, because it seems to me that self-other dynamic that's really a core of our conversation this week breaks down at some point in our human evolution. When it does that, maybe then we use markings. We use ritualistic markings on our faces to define our clan from the next clan, because it's a matter of survival. You will, die if you don't protect yourself. So very interesting to think about how the body, whether it's clothing or tattoos or facial coloring or whatever, really relates to potentially a lot of this. Now, body alteration, I think, is really key here. Body alteration could actually be something that is prohibited or something that is required for a religion. So you start to see, kind of like in that empty vessel sense, it could be one or the other. It can be both. It's just a matter of the belief system. This obviously is something also that relates to things like power and agency and various dynamics. You can see examples here of various cultures from around the world, including the so-called Long Neck tribe in Myanmar. So a lot of interesting stuff to consider here with body alteration. Tattoos are also a favorite subject. It seems to me that there's always a section on tattooing in any anthropology of religion course, and I think one of the reasons for that is it's a very literal affixing of a symbol on your body. Now, sometimes, of course, tattoos are very secular. They're not always the realm of the sacred, and we have many examples of that, but many times they are the realm of the sacred, and as a result, I think this is a very great opportunity to consider the significance of tattoos. I'll probably have a question this week that just asks you about your own meanings behind tattoos. Again, if you're willing and able to talk about this stuff, by all means. Self-mortification, I mentioned earlier the example of the Mandan Indians or Native Americans from years ago, where you might hang from hooks and you participate in self-mortification to achieve an altered state of consciousness. So I think it's quite interesting. Flagellation is an example here. Certain Catholic practices, self-immolation in Tibetan Buddhism, very life-ending, right? This kind of stuff. So not all these practices, again, when we get into this section about prohibition and negativity, we're really thinking in the realm of this is not always, quote, good for people. And again, what is good and what is bad is quite subjective. I would offer to you again that cultural relativism has its limits. And we get into areas where someone might say, I don't think it's cool to fast for a religious purpose because it could alter your body. You could die. You could go into a coma. That's happened with fasting. So we're really in the realm of the subjective, very much open to debate and conversation this week. You can look at the piece with the Pope self-flagellate, kind of a different piece there to look at this week. And then food laws. Now, food laws, I think, are one of the best examples out there of prohibition. If I say to you, you can only eat these types of foods, whether it's kosher diet or halal diet, in Islam, in Judaism, there are very strict requirements about the preparation of meat, having a rabbi there, other principles of slaughtering in particular ways, separating certain types of food. It could be meat from milk products, etc. And again, this stuff is written into sacred text. It is passed down through the generations. A lot of different groups here. Seventh-day Adventism is focused on veganism. I actually remember years ago eating at a Seventh-day Adventist restaurant in New York City because, again, New York City, not unlike LA, has so much cultural and religious diversity. So many interesting examples out there, even going down to, you think about, I believe like in Jainism, if you have a vegetarian diet where maybe you wouldn't consume certain types of vegetables that grow on the earth because potentially you might, like an onion or a piece of garlic, pull that out of the earth and potentially there could be an insect in it. And if you eat it, that's potentially killing that animal. I think it's a great opportunity to connect to your own dietary restrictions that you might have or not have, and to what degree you've questioned or thought about these. A lot of these were brought up with. I remember growing up Catholic, certain things we did. We weren't a strict Catholic family, but, sometimes you're curious, like, well, how did this happen? This whole thing with Lent or whatever. So opportunities, I think, to unpack and do a little bit of cultural deconstruction of some of our traditions. Now, possession is also interesting. You could say possession potentially might be seen as very negative, as something that is not good for people to practice. And probably one of the main reasons for that is if you are potentially, and I'm just looking at here, we have one more to go. I'm trying to keep track on my other screen here. So this is our last one in part 2. Bodies and prohibition, and then we get into part 3, religion and the negative. So I'm just reminding myself of that. But, possession is something that a lot of us would say is probably not good for the person being possessed. Now, again, for an anthropologist, as we'll talk about maybe when we talk about ghosts, whether or not someone is really possessed, I think is, up to debate. It's not something empirically that we can prove. But, people sometimes wonder, they watch horror movies on TV and they sometimes say, well, is it possible that someone could be possessed by a spirit? So a lot of mystery out there, a lot of, subjective gray area kind of stuff that we can't answer with empirical evidence, but that's okay. Anthropology, again, studies the unknown. We don't attempt to know everything in the world. We try to just come to terms with what is available and what we can understand given that information. So you can look at spirit possession and ask some questions about what it means. There are some anthropologists that have studied spirit possession and said that it serves maybe social purposes more than actual practical personal purposes. It might seem to you as the individual in that emic sense that it has this meaning, but in reality, it's something else. Maybe it's a form of psychotherapy. Maybe it gives you some peace of mind or something to have this ability to kind of be a little bit abnormal and act in a possessed way, whatever that might be like. And again, there are so many examples here. This is actually the study from Malaysia I was thinking of a second ago, Iowa Ong's work from the late 80s. Sometimes I think people think of The Exorcist, and I think there's some new spin-offs of Friedkin's original movie, The Exorcist, which is certainly one of the great films out there that deals with kind of this topic, but that should not be our only context. Indeed, the case study of Voodoo from Haiti and other cultures, I think, is really worth our time, and I've added this here as well in this section. It's a pretty long section here this week, or not that long, I guess a decent amount of information. So that closes that part 2, and now we get into what we're calling religion and the negative. So by this we mean religion that potentially has negative consequences for our world. So as we talked about earlier, this dialectic, the self and the other, and again, we question whether or not it's the case in early human society if altruism was present, and this kind of will be the bookend or takes us to section 4, which is on the global ethic. But when we're talking about the self and other, and we get into things like religious justification of war, we'll talk about just war theory, some other examples, we're definitely saying that religion from a evolutionary perspective is maybe negative for our species. If we are all killing one another, it's probably going to be the case that we could say it's not great that religion is encouraging us to invade another country. Think of the madman Putin right now invading the Ukraine here still in 2023. All his ridiculous justifications, and you think of all the death and the rape and carnage, the killing of children that's going on, simply because of his ability to rally support for some sort of gross xenophobic, nationalistic cause of hate of various forms. So religion as justification, we're talking about here the idea that I say, because of my religion, I am just in killing another person, or I am just in saying these people have to be persecuted or put in prison. And I think it's something that we see in so many societies. You know, going back, we know about the Salem witchcraft trials of hundreds of years ago. Same thing in those cases. Someone will find information here and say, well, in the Bible it says this, or in the Quran it says this. And as a result of that, particularly if someone is very much fundamentalist, which we'll talk about this week as well, you have a real problem there on your hands, because potentially then the person is justifying the killing of others because it says so in some religious text. And my personal view on religion, I may have said this, I think in week 1 or maybe in the introduction to this class, here is my personal sort of code on religion. My view is that if your religion is not harming another person or animals or harming the environment, or justifying warfare, slavery, persecution, rape, whatever ills might be out there, then I'm perfectly fine with you believing in that religion. The problem comes in for me personally is when we have this kind of stuff. When violence accompanies religion, or when violence accompanies politics, and someone says, hey, we're going to definitely be right, as Putin has said, in invading the Ukraine and killing people and destroying property and causing massive humanitarian consequences, costing us trillions of dollars, the planet trillions of dollars, because of how expensive warfare is, then I draw my personal line. And we've seen examples of this ranging from Nigeria, Boko Haram, to ISIS, of course, recently in Iraq and Syria. We can think about Al-Qaeda going back to 9/11, which has its roots in religion, the Crusades many, many years ago. So all of these examples, I think, remind us that there is a lot of violence associated with religion. So we should have some conversations this week. Why is that the case? And then how do we prevent that kind of sectarianism that we see going on in the world, such that people are inclined to believe a cult leader or a religious leader who says, follow me because I know the way. And again, that's fine if you're, practicing a religion that doesn't harm anyone. But if you're knowing the way means, like Jim Jones with the People's Temple in Guyana, that you're going to kill hundreds of people in the process of your religion, I would say that's the point, at least for me personally, where religious freedom ends. If you're committing violence, if you are a parent, again, this is my personal view, and you're saying, my child could be saved by going to the doctor, but it's God's will not to save that child in that moment, and we're going to let the child die, I would say, no, you don't get to make that decision. You might say, well, why or why not? Well, because what if you're wrong? What if you're wrong that God doesn't want to save this child? What if God doesn't exist, etc., right? Like, we can't allow, I think, our social civil society to be based on religion. I'm a firm believer in the separation of church and state, because if you're not from the religion at hand, or if you don't practice that religion or believe in that religion, and we're going to start to persecute you because of your belief system, that creates some, as we go into fundamentalism here, fundamental problems with your ability just to have a society that's functioning and normal and hopefully cohesive and in a state of whatever equilibrium. So fundamentalism, we know, whether it's Christian fundamentalism or the fundamentalism of ISIS or Al-Qaeda that we've talked about with 9/11, is an example where basically you believe that your biblical text is the fundamental thing. It's the nature, it's the foundation, and you believe it's truth with a capital T. We talked about truth with a small t, truth with a capital T. This is like capital T, flashing neon, 100-foot, 10,000 point font kind of thing. It's like in your face, fundamentalism. And fundamentalism is controversial because it's taking a literal view of the Bible or the Quran or whatever religious text and saying, to go back to our previous discussion here about prohibition, because it literally says this in the Bible, you can or cannot do this. Again, anyone who is educated, anyone who studied just about anything would say, well, guess what? Everything is a translation. Everything is, passed down from one group of people to another. And as a translation, do we really want to rely on your word saying it is the word of God or the word of the prophet if we're deciding someone's life or death? I mean, it shows you kind of the ridiculous extent to which fundamentalism can lead to such negative consequences in our society, including sacrifice. So if we say we're going to sacrifice an animal or sacrifice a human, Mayan society gets talked about this a lot. Well, what do you think about that? Because if you're the person or thing or animal being sacrificed, you may not have such a great opinion of that happening. So again, we're really looking at these negative sorts of things, persecution. So religious persecution means going back to, say, the witch hunts or the Holocaust. Some of these are political versus religious or both. Even in the Nazis with the National Socialists, there was a lot of mysticism that was rooted in their Aryan white supremacy, white nationalism. So even that itself has kind of roots in the mystical. And there are all sorts of mystical practices that a lot of Nazis were involved in. So a lot of these examples here, Boko Haram, ISIS, Boko Haram committing so many terrorist attacks in Nigeria. I believe that one big mall attack was committed by them. So you have examples here of where people feel, again, justified and they want to persecute other groups of people because they feel like they're less holy. It reminds us of the great chain of being we talked about a few weeks ago, where because some people are higher on the religious or spiritual order than the others we might have to go after, persecute, kill, torture, whatever. Think of the Salem witchcraft trials again. So a lot to unpack here. I think a lot of critical conversations can be had here. This particular source here is from Pew, and this is from 2018, but I think it's really good because it's showing you that in a lot of societies where you have a prevalence of political authoritarianism, rule by a very strict government. Just give me a second for the phone to stop ringing there, and I'll continue to talk. Okay, I think it's done. So if you have an authoritarian society where there's a very strict rule by a leader or a particular political party, there seems to be a correlation that in those particular governments, there's a strict inability of people to participate in certain forms of religion. People have often talked about how atheism is maybe like the official religion in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, Russia, and so forth. So it's interesting to think about people in any society being told what they can or cannot believe in. And again, it's my personal belief that you should never have an authoritarian society that said you can't believe in anything. That would be horrible, because people should be able to believe in what they want. Again, my personal opinion, so long as they're not harming others in that process. Now, the very worst possible situation is what we call religious war. So if you've studied Christianity, ancient Christianity, you know about the Crusades and the Holy Land, you get situations in today's day and age. You think about what's happening between Israel and Palestine with, holy sites and debates about holy sites. Very scary stuff, because this stuff is rooted in history, and we know that the past is typically prologue, and thus it often defines things. So wars may start again because of previous situations of religious or political wars. So think about some of these. Again, that word sectarianism is coming up here. Religion and terrorism, we could say, is often connected to history and identity politics and so forth. That was kind of the heavy stuff. So we'll end here this week with the example of Western yoga. And I wanted to use this one because it's not really like a prohibition thing. It is certainly using the body. I don't think it's negative, although I've heard cases where people have said, like, if you want my child to practice yoga in school, I consider that a form of devil worship or something like that. So even yoga, I think, kind of devoid of its spiritual context, has been used politically by people to say, I don't believe in it and my kids shouldn't participate in it in a school activity or whatever. But I wanted to use it here because it does relate to the body. It's primarily about the body. It involves things like meditation and a certain state of mind, and indeed a state of mind that could have spiritual meaning. And I think the connection here to make is this idea that in its sort of original, if you will, Southeast Asian society context, like in India, it has a certain meaning and a certain religious connection. And then as it becomes part of kind of a Western mindset, I'm thinking of like Lululemon, the very high-end yoga store that you can find at the Summit Mall in Reno here, just not too far down the road. It's a much different context that might be stripped of cultural identity, of religious identity, and so forth. I've given you a couple of videos this week to check out. I think the best thing might be to watch one or both of these videos. One is from Vice, and I think Vice is often kind of cutting edge. They do very innovative kinds of journalism. So I would recommend you watch one or both of those videos just to get a sense of what we're getting at here. There's also a third video here, Why Are Americans Obsessed with Yoga? And one of these is fairly humorous. So you can check that out. It kind of ends that section. I thought we needed something a little lighter and more fun. And I'm primarily looking at this week, your opinion on yoga. Do you practice it? What do you think of it? Is it cultural appropriation? Is it not? Do we need to know the historical, spiritual, cultural traditions, foundations of something like yoga in order for us to be a practitioner of it today in a secular context? Why or why not kind of thing. So like cultural awareness of whether or not yoga is a form of cultural appropriation. Now we'll end in part 4 here, and this is the global ethic. Again, this is going back to the work of Hans Küng, the Swiss Catholic priest and theologian. He, I believe, had a connection to the late Pope Benedict, who I would say was one of the more controversial popes, and I think he was excommunicated. There was a whole thing where they basically thought he was too radical for the Catholic Church, which is a total shame here. I mean, we should have folks like this in our main religions so they could help push them forward. Fortunately, Hans Küng, as a theologian, has really pushed us to think about what we call the global ethic. And there's been this gathering of the world's religions going back to, I believe, 1893 at the World's Columbian Expo. And of course, Hans Küng wasn't around at that time. And they're just saying here at the Parliament in 1993, so I think they must have did a 100-year plus kind of, tribute or something like that. But the idea behind this is to bring all the world's religions together, as many that are willing to participate, and see, can we commit ourselves to shared values such that we can be positive for the planet? And so you can see here, these are kind of 4 key principles: commitment to culture of nonviolence, respect for life. So this is directly challenging that stuff we talked about this week on religious war. We're saying it's not okay to use your religion to justify the death of other people or animals. And to some degree, I think I kind of connect to just about every aspect of what they're talking about here. And you're going to get the long version of this in a second. The second is solidarity and a just economic order. So if you believe in your holy text that everyone is equally of value, and again, I think our theme for this week is that self-other dialectic. So if you define another person as being equal in your eyes under God or under gods or whatever religion you are following, under Christ, etc., then doesn't it make sense that if someone is starving on the street and they don't have a living wage, you're not really acting out on your religious beliefs, right? Words and deeds. So we're really challenging this kind of stuff this week. Third, commitment to a culture of tolerance, a life of truthfulness. I think this relates to the idea of authenticity. You want to spark honest and open dialogue with other individuals. You don't want to be narcissistic. A lot of these could go back to some of the positive commandments or prohibitions that some religions have suggested. And a commitment to a culture of equal rights and partnership between men and women. I would say that should be extended to LGBTQI plus rights, and to say that, we don't allow religions to say that men and women are unequal. And as I gave that example, going back to my days teaching at a religious school some time back, over 25 plus years ago, women couldn't do a holy service in the chapel on a Sunday kind of thing. So commitment to culture of equal rights and partnership between men and women talks a little about the legacy of Hans Kung. He just passed away, I want to say 2 years ago. Now, this is what I really recommend you click on. This will give you a little background on Kung's work. I believe it's a interview with him. And then I think lastly, I included in here, I hope I did, this is about the global ethic, and it gives you a little biographical insight into Kung's life. And I think I also included here a copy of the text. If not, I'm going to add it here, but I believe I did. Indeed, it is here. So you can download it here. And this, I think, is very important because even though I give you those 4 key points in that summary page, you really do want to take a look at the entire global ethic to see what it involves. And I used to do an activity that I thought was kind of fun in my face-to-face class of the same class, the 107. And I asked people to sit down and circle the things they thought that would be good. So do you think that we should treat every human humanely? And believe me, not everyone necessarily is going to say that. Maybe they wouldn't admit that in a public class activity, but maybe in private they would. I don't think necessarily everyone will agree with all these. The culture of nonviolence. So this gets into much more detail. I think what I'll do is set up the discussion board in such a way that you can respond to these and go through the text and say, yeah, that might work, that might not work, and so forth. But for me, it's one of the most powerful statements I've ever seen on this idea of bringing together and having a congress of all the world's religions. And by the way, this includes Native American groups, shamanic groups. It's not just the big players, it's not sort of just you have your NBA all team, your 50 greatest player, the dream team. No, it's every religion, as much as they're willing to participate, coming together and having a dialogue and conversation about this global ethics. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity to close out this module this week, kind of on a positive note, because we've talked about a lot of negative stuff. And this is where your discussion topics, of course, will show up for the week. So that is going to be it here for week 5, looking at these 4 topics. I think there's a good amount of information to digest. Again, as always, keep up with your quizzes, do your discussion posts in the class. When questions come up, send me a note here in the inbox or stop by my office if you're here on campus. I'm just upstairs in the faculty suites. That's going to do it this week for the week 5 lecture. I'll be back next week with our lecture for week 6.